Chapter 13. Paul knew where he was. He was home. Sort of. It wasn't his room. Well, it was the same room he lived in, because there was the fireplace, there was the window, and there was the bed, there was the table, there was the damp patch on the wall that looked like a map of Turkey drawn by Salvador Dali. But it wasn't his room. It was the way the room he lived in would probably have looked over 100 or so years ago. Been here before, of course. Nice enough room in its way, a merry blaze in the fireplace, same as last time he'd been there. But it still didn't have a door. "Hello," said a voice behind him. He spun round and saw two young men in Victorian clothes standing in the corner by the wardrobe. One had thick curly hair. The other one, he seemed to remember, was called Pip, and it was he who said, "It's all right." "Oh, good," Paul said. "What's all right?" Pip grinned, not that sort of grin, and pointed. On the floor next to the bed lay a goblin. It wasn't moving, though whether it was asleep, stunned or dead wasn't immediately apparent. "She tripped over the fire guard, would you believe?" Pip continued. "Bumped her head on the mantelpiece. Only a little bump. She'll be right as rain directly, so," he went on, "where is it?" Before Paul could say anything, Sophie pushed past him. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. "And where is this?" The two young men didn't reply. They'd taken one look at Sophie and immediately looked away. The curly-haired specimen had gone red as a beetroot. A moment of baffled silence, and then Paul realised what it was. He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "Quick, get behind me." She looked at him. "Why? Are they dangerous?" "Just do it, all right?" It must have been his tone of voice, because with only a very slight hesitation she did as she'd been told. Paul cleared his throat self-consciously and said, "Actually, that's how women dress when I come from." The man called Pip looked shocked and fascinated at the same time. "You don't say?" Paul nodded. "That's right." "Good Lord, you mean that's normal?" He was now several shades redder than his colleague. Knees and things?" "Absolutely," Paul said. "In fact, what the young lady's got on is sort of like formal wear, for work, in the office." Pip was staring at him now. "They work? In offices?" "Yes, just like that?" "Hey," Sophie growled, shoving Paul out of the way. "What the bloody hell?" "It's okay," Paul said quickly. "You don't understand. These people, gentlemen," he amended quickly. So many people to offend, so little time. They're sort of from the past. Victorians." "Oh." From the look on Sophie's face, Paul might as well have said they were Martians, though probably she'd have preferred Martians as being less alien. "Oh, I see." The curly-haired man coughed obtrusively. "Perhaps you'd like to introduce us to the young lady," he said. "What? All right," Paul grinned feebly. "This is Sophie Pettingale. She works with me. I'm sorry," he went on, "but I still haven't got a clue who you are." The two young men nodded politely to Sophie. She stared at them with a look of fascinated horror on her face. Paul noticed she was keeping perfectly still, as if she expected them to attack at any moment. "My name," said the curly-haired's friend, "is Philip Catherwood, though most people call me Pip. This is my friend and colleague, Arthur Tanner." Tanner, Paul thought, and then Philip Catherwood. He'd seen that name before, on all those passbooks and share certificates and deeds and stuff in the strong room. Hello," he said. "Pleased to meet you," he added, hoping it was the right thing to say. "Oh," he added, and I'm Paul Carpenter." "Well, yes," Phip replied, frowning slightly. "We know that. We've met before." "Look," unmistakable sound of Sophie rapidly approaching the end of her rope. "If someone doesn't hurry up and tell me what the fuck is going on..." It was almost worth the whole thing just to see the expression on the young men's faces. Paul felt like he ought to explain. That's another thing they do nowadays, besides working and wearing short skirts. But on balance, he reckoned it'd be better leave it to context, and let them sort out the culture shock for themselves. "Actually," he said, "I wouldn't mind an explanation myself, if that's all right with you." Pip nodded feebly, as if he still hadn't recovered. "What would you like me to explain?" he said. For some reason, that made Paul feel angry. "Oh, this and that," he said. "Some of it I've sort of figured out for myself, like why you freak out when you see a girl's knees. But Goblin's something you can take in your stride. But when the hell is this? And is this place 36 Coronation Terrace? And if so, what are you doing in my flat? And where in God's name is the door? And why is there a bloody great sword and a stone in the middle of our floor? And what the bloody hell," he added, with a degree of vehemence he wouldn't have believed himself capable, "have Gilbert and Sullivan got to do with all this?" The other one, Arthur Tanner, looked at him. "What does freak out mean?" he asked. "Be quiet, Arthur," Pip said. Then he looked at Paul thoughtfully. "You don't know, do you?" he said. "Nobody's told you." "No," Paul said. "They haven't." "Ah, in that case," Pip said, "I think we all better sit down. This may take some time." "It was back in 77, Pip said, "that it all started. Oh, perhaps I should say 1877. What year is it where you come from, by the way? Really? Oh, good Lord. Anyway, as I was saying, back in 77, Arthur here and I were young clerks, freshly out of our indentures with the well-respected city firm of sorcerers J.W.Wells and Co. One Monday morning, Mr. John Wells, the senior partner, called us both into his office. He told us that he wanted us to look after something for him. He sounded fearfully mysterious about it, but of course we were used to that by then, after 2 years with the firm. You do know about J.W.Wells and Co., don't you? What they actually do? Ah, capital. Naturally, we didn't like to ask John Wellington, that's what we called him in the office, though never to his face, needless to say, what it was all about. That wouldn't have done at all, but greatly to our surprise, the old man proceeded to tell us anyway, and shocking stuff it was, too. He said that he recently found out that his nephew, young Mr. Humphrey Wells, was plotting with a couple of the other partners to get rid of him, apparently. Mr. Humphrey was fed up with waiting for the old devil to retire. He'd been talking about giving up for the last 200 years, but nothing had ever come of it, and he had decided to do something about it himself. But old John Wellington never had any intention of giving up, mostly because he couldn't abide the thought of Mr. Humphrey getting his hands on the business. To be honest with you, we weren't in the least surprised about that. We'd known for some time that there was bad blood between them, because John Wellington didn't like the sort of thing Mr. Humphrey got up to. He reckoned it was unethical, if not downright dishonest and wicked, and I have to say that we agreed with him entirely. But to get back to what I was saying, the reason he'd sent for us, John Wellington said, was to entrust to us a certain very powerful sorcerous item, which we were to keep safe at all costs, because if, as J.W. suspected, Mr. Humphrey were ever to do something dreadful to him, such as turn him into a frog or imprison him in a glass mountain, the only magic strong enough to be sure of rescuing him and setting him free again was the same object, a talisman if you care to think of it like that, though John Wellington used some other word to describe it, which slips my mind for the moment. In any case, he gave this thing to us, and we made very sure that one or other of us kept it with him at all times. It was very small and light, you see, small enough to be carried in a waistcoat pocket or hung on a watch chain. It was shortly after that meeting that old Mr. John Wellington disappeared. The story that we were told in the office was that something had gone terribly wrong with a job he'd been doing for some clients down the West Country, something to do with the love philtre, and the only way in which the mess could be put right for J.W. himself to be sacrificed to the evil one, who duly turned up, we were told, and carried the poor old boy away to a very bad place. Of course, Arthur and I weren't taken in by this at all, not after what J.W. had told us. We knew that the only evil one involved was Mr. Humphrey, who'd clearly been and done something frightful to the old boy. Furthermore, it was up to us to find out what it was and put matters right. But before we could set about it, we were told to see Mr. Humphrey in his office late one Friday afternoon. We didn't like the sound of that, as you can imagine, but we had no choice in the matter, so off we went. Mr. Humphrey didn't mince his words. He knew that the old man had given us a talisman, and he wanted it. He began by offering us money, then promotion, then partnerships in the firm, but we'd have none of it. It goes without saying. That made him very angry, and he threatened us with all manner of dire consequences. But strangely enough, after a while, he told us to get out of his sight, and there the matter seemed to rest. We thought this rather extraordinary, since, of course, he could have used spells of compulsion to force us to hand the thing over, or even blasted us into ashes with lightning, if he'd wanted to. But instead he simply told us to get out and let's go. We heard no more about it for several weeks, and that seemed to be the end of it. Then one day, Mr. Suslovich, you know him? Yes, splendid. He sent for us and told us he'd be obliged if we'd spend a day or so clearing out the strong room and putting the securities and so forth in order, as the place was rather a mess. So he set to, and a fair old job it turned out to be, as you might imagine. On the last day, when the work was nearly done, Mr. Humphrey's secretary, Miss Julia, you know her too, came down to the strong room with a box of bits and pieces to be put away with the rest. Among them we found a most curious thing, a cardboard tube containing an India rubber mat in the shape of a door, but of course you know all about that. Well, as you could imagine, better than most, after we'd read the instructions that came with it, we were quite fascinated by this curiosity, and couldn't resist the temptation of trying it out. We spread it out against the strong room wall, and when the door appeared, we opened it, wedged it ajar with a heavy book, and went in. Being somewhat cautious, we commanded it to take us no further than our own lodgings, and sure enough, as we stepped through the doorway, that was where we found ourselves. Except that of our own door, I mean the real door that connected our rooms to the rest of the building, there was no sign. Scarcely had we made this discovery when we became aware of a man standing in the doorway. The magical doorway, I mean, the one we'd put up against the strong room wall. To our horror, we saw it was Mr. Humphrey Wells, and he was grinning at us with the most devilish expression on his face. His exact words escaped me, but he told us that since we wouldn't give him the talisman, and since in any case we knew far more about his business than was good for us, it would be as well if we were, as he put it, got out of harm's way for good. Then, before we could protest or do anything about it, he slammed the door in our faces and it vanished without trace, leaving us, I need hardly to tell you, in a room with no door. And here, he said, we've been ever since. Silence. And then Paul heard himself say, "You mean here? In this room? For the best part of 130? Pip nodded. Just you and him? The two of you? Not tactful. A scowl flitted across Pip's face before he replied. I must confess it's been something of a strain on our friendship, he said. In fact, there have been times when I felt I could strangle poor Arthur with my bare hands. Indeed, I have, several times, but it doesn't seem to have any effect. Neither, he added with a slight shudder, does stabbing, beating him over the head with a poker, or drowning him in the wash-basin. So after a while I gave it up as a bad job. Nowadays, you must play chess instead, or dominoes, or nomination whist. It helps relieve the tension, but without the bad feeling afterwards. Paul's jaw dropped, and he made no effort to close it. Of course, the other one put in, we had no idea it was so long. For all we knew, until you showed up, we might only have been here a day or so, but with time seeming to pass terribly slowly. It felt like 100 years, right enough, but so did going to tea with my Aunt Elizabeth when I was a boy. 100 years, he repeated. I suppose things have changed, rather. Paul nodded. A bit, he said. Well, obviously, Pip said, pointedly not looking at Sophie's knees. Ladies' clothing, for one thing. I don't imagine we'd feel very much at home in your time, he added thoughtfully. All this time, Sophie had been standing very still with a worried look on her face. Now she interrupted. Doesn't make any difference, does it? You're not coming back with us. The two clerks looked at her. So did Paul. Oh, for God's sake, she said. Haven't you figured it out yet? None of us is going back, or going anywhere, or anywhen. We're stuck here. There's no fucking door. Maybe it hit the two clerks hardest. Maybe not. And I'll say it before any of you do, Sophie went on. There's no door, and it's all my fault because I closed it. So if we're stranded here for infinity, I'm the one who's to blame, right? Long, awkward pause. Easy enough mistake to make, Paul mumbled. I mean, you weren't to know. Actually, Arthur started to say, but then he must have caught sight of Paul's face because he went on, absolutely, it could have happened to anybody. It just seemed to make Sophie angry. Screw you, she shouted. The lot of you. I mean, we're marooned in this horrible little room and all you lot can do is stand there being bloody chivalrous. Isn't anyone ever going to take anything seriously? With respect, Pip said quietly,
I don't see how falling out with each other is going to help. Besides, as Carpenter has just pointed out, you had no way of knowing—" "Shut up!" Sophie shouted. "When I say it's all my stupid fault, why the hell won't anyone believe me? None of this would have happened if I hadn't put that stupid filter in his tea."
"You did what?" Paul said.
"Oh."
Paul was scowling horribly. "You put that stuff in my tea? For crying out loud, what did you want to go and do that for? I know you aren't interested in me, but why in God's name did you want me to go falling in love with that bloody goblin?" Sophie gave him a look you could have stored mammoths in.
"What goblin?"
she said. And then Paul figured it out. Oh, he thought, and then, oh shit, because, and just to add the whipped cream and the glacé cherry on top, he had a sneaking feeling that it was no coincidence, Arthur's second name being Tanner. "You know," he said, "her, the one I told you about, the receptionist."
"Oh."
Sophie's eyes widened.
"Oh, you thought—"
"Yes."
"Oh."
The two clerks had gone bright pink and were pretending to be utterly fascinated by a scrap of cobweb in the corner of the ceiling. "So it was you who—" Paul said.
"That's right."
"Because you—"
"Yes."
"Oh." Of course, what he should probably have done now was throw his arms around her and say, "But you didn't have to, I love you anyway." But he didn't do that. Instead, he wobbled, grabbed the back of his chair to stop himself from falling over, and said, "Bloody hell." He realised while he was saying it that it wasn't quite the most felicitous speech he'd ever made, but by then it was too late. Sophie was staring at the scrap of rug visible between her feet.
"I suppose I ought to say sorry," she said.
"Sorry?" Paul echoed helplessly.
"Yes, all right. I know it's not going to be a blind bit of good saying sorry, and obviously you're going to hate me forever and ever, but—"
"What's there to be sorry about?" Paul said. That's wonderful." Over her shoulder, Paul could see the two clerks cringing. To hell with them, he thought.
"No, it's not," Sophie insisted. It's a total disaster, and it's all my—"
"For God's sake, Sophie, shut up!" He jumped up to go to her, caught his foot in the fold of the rug and fell heavily against Pip's knees. Pip yowled with pain and lashed out reflexively, hitting Paul on the nose with the heel of his hand. Then Sophie hit Pip with a chair.
"What the bloody hell's going on?"
said a bewildered-sounding voice from over by the window. All of them swung round and saw the goblin, Mr. Tanner's mum, sitting up on the bed and staring at them. Well, at one of them.
"Arthur?"
she said. The clerk called Arthur gaped back at her, and then something seemed to click into place.
"Rosie?"
he whispered. Paul wasn't completely on the ball, what with the angels singing and the bluebirds zooming about overhead and all the sun coming out from behind the clouds and all that sort of thing, but he could still hop to some more obvious conclusions, and the manner in which the curly-haired clerk, whose name was Tanner, and Mr. Tanner's mum, hurled themselves into each other's arms with a crash like a lorry hitting a pillar box, seemed to suggest he wasn't too wide of the mark at that.
"Sweetheart,"
sobbed the clerk.
"Honey pedal,"
crooned Mr. Tanner's mum. Sophie nudged Paul in the ribs.
"What the hell's going on?"
she whispered. "Shh," Paul replied. "Apparently, that's our Mr. Tanner's dad."
"But she's a—"
"Yes."
"Oh."
Paul shifted slightly so as to avoid any risk of seeing what Mr. Tanner's mum and Arthur the clerk were getting up to. "Forget about them," he said. Do you really put that stuff in my tea?"
"Yes,"
Sophie said.
"Look, would you mind not going on about that?
Only what?" She frowned.
"Oh, what the hell,"
she said, and kissed him. Compared with what was happening on the other side of the room, it was no big deal. Children and people of a nervous disposition could have witnessed it with no lasting damage. As far as Paul was concerned, however, it was without doubt the most amazing thing that ever happened in the whole history of the universe. So it was hardly surprising that the other clerk, Pip, had to tap him on the shoulder several times before he managed to get his attention.
"Excuse me,"
said Pip, "but would you mind awfully not doing that? I mean, we've got to spend all eternity cooped up in here together. Well, for one thing, I'm going to feel just a bit left out, if you see what I mean." All eternity. Just then, Paul couldn't see anything particularly wrong with all eternity being much like the moment he had been interrupted in the middle of. Even so, he could see Pip's point, and so apparently could Sophie. The same couldn't be said of Arthur and Mr. Tanner's mom, but there didn't seem to be a lot that any of them could do about that, even with buckets of cold water.
I suppose we could use the curtains to close off that half of the room, Sophie said, but that wouldn't solve the problem of the noises.
I heard that, growled Mr. Tanner's mum. Should be ashamed of yourselves, bloody perverts. It's all right, she added. You can turn around now. Paul wasn't so sure about that and stayed where he was. Sorry, he said, only... Yes, all right, I get the message. More to the point, we like a bit of privacy if it's all the same to you. I think we need to get out of here.
Really, Sophie said. What a brilliant idea. Maybe you could tell us how.
Sarky, Mr. Tanner's mum sighed. Actually, she said, it's that easy for you two. This time Paul did turn round. What? How? Not so fast, Mr. Tanner's mum replied. First, you've got to promise me you'll come back and let us out.
Yes, of course, Sophie said. So what have we got to do?
Simple. I'm assuming you've both had your little chat with Ricky Wormtoter. It took a second or so for Paul to figure out what she was referring to. Oh, you mean when he gave us the prefect badges? That's right, Mr. Tanner's mum said. He's a good boy, young Ricky. He'll have you out here in 2 shakes. Just press the badge and yell help, and you'll be back in the office before you can see employer's liability insurance. Sophie was fumbling for her badge already, but Paul hesitated. Back in the office, he repeated. That's right. Simple counter-inversion. Same as you'd use if you'd lost your car keys. Fine, Paul said. But if we go straight back to the office, how do we rescue you? The door's still on the train. Mr. Tanner's mum hadn't thought of that. Shit, she said. Long silence, during which Mr. Tanner's mum sat down in the big armchair with her head in her hands, while the 2 clerks stood by looking embarrassed. Finally, Sophie said,
Well, I can see that's awkward for you 3, but really that's no reason why Paul and I have got to stay here. Look, when we get back, maybe we could ask Mr. Wormtoter if he knows how to get you out of here. Or we could go to the Lost Property Office at Euston, see if his store thing gets handed in. What is his store thing anyhow? She added.
Mr. Tanner's mum called her a rude name. Sophie replied in kind, and things would probably have got rather fraught if Paul hadn't said, excuse me, 3 times, followed by, shut up, once. I've had an idea, he said. Much to Paul's surprise, it worked. Not that he enjoyed it, not one bit. The counter-inversion got them back to the office just fine, but the sensation, the nearest Paul could ever get to describing it, was a bit like being sneezed out of God's nostril, only backwards. Was no fun at all. Neither, though in a different way, was hurtling through the clouds 10,000 feet above the ground on the back of Mr. Wormtoter's milk-white winged horse. Sure, it was fast, and it seemed to know the way without having to be steered or anything, and he supposed, as they soared over Birmingham at several times the speed of sound, that it was nice of Mr. Wormtoter to lend him the horrible animal. On balance, though, he'd rather have walked. The horse stopped them both on the platform at Stafford just as the train started to pull in. Didn't hang about, and for some reason or other, all the other people on the platform were looking the other way. As soon as the train came to a halt, they shoved through the nearest door and ran down the corridor, just in time to see the portable door being shovelled into a cleaner's black plastic sack. Paul hesitated, but Sophie pushed past him, snatched it out, grabbed Paul by the arm and dragged him off the train just as it pulled away.
There, she said, as they stood panting on the platform. Now will you tell me what this stupid thing does?
So Paul told her. Her first reaction was to be bitterly hurt and offended that he hadn't mentioned it before. He had no reply to that, but there was one thing he had to say before they went any further. Listen, he said, if you want to, you can go back in time. I'll stay here and keep the door open for you, and stop yourself putting that stuff in my tea. If you want to. I mean, if you thought better of it, or something like that. She looked at him with rather more of the old Sophie in her expression than he'd have liked.
Why?
She said. Oh, I just thought...
That'd be stupid, she interrupted, because then we wouldn't have been trapped in that strange room, and we'd never found those 2 Clark people, and so they'd never have had a chance of being rescued, so they'd have to stay there for ever and ever, and that disgusting goblin woman would never get her boyfriend back, and... She stopped. And anyway, she went on, I'd still love you, even if I didn't spike your tea with the filter stuff, so there wouldn't be any point, would there?
No, Paul said. I just thought...
Don't,
Sophie said.
Right, you better do whatever it is you do with this thing, and hurry up, because people are staring.
This time, Sophie stayed behind to make sure the door was kept open, Paul went through, and sure enough, there was the room, more or less as they'd left it, except that the two clerks and Mr. Tanner's mum were sitting around the table playing cards. For some reason, neither of the clerks was wearing any clothes. "Strip canasta," Mr. Tanner's mum explained, as the two clerks dressed hurriedly. "You were gone such a long time, we had to find something to do to amuse ourselves." "Fine," Paul said. "Now can we get a move on, please?" "Spoil sport," Mr. Tanner's mum said, as she led the way, followed by Arthur, followed by Pip, still struggling with his bootlaces. But when Arthur tried to cross the threshold, "I'm stuck," he said. Mr. Tanner's mum clicked her tongue. "For crying out loud," she said, "this is no time for stupid jokes." It's not a joke," said Tanner in a tragic voice. "I can't move. I'm stuck." Mr. Tanner's mum reached out a long, scaly arm, grabbed him by the elbow and heaved. Arthur yelled like a cat being skinned alive, but didn't budge. Mr. Tanner's mum went a pale shade of aquamarine. "How about you?" she asked Pip. "You try." But Pip couldn't pass through the door either. "It's that bastard Humphrey," Mrs. Tanner's mum snarled. "He's put a lock on the fucking door." Then she sat down on the platform tarmac and burst into tears. Paul and Sophie looked at her, then back at the door. It had snapped shut, gone limp and fallen off the wall. They tried to set it up again, but it wouldn't stick. It just kept rolling sadly down again, like misbehaving wallpaper. Eventually they saw a guard approaching with a policeman and decided it was time to leave. The last thing they needed, they decided, was for Mr. Tanner's mum to start disemboweling people in broad daylight in a public place. "It's a lock," Mr. Tanner's mum explained, as they walked slowly down the street away from the station. "Just like any other sort of lock, except it only affects certain people, the ones you want to keep in, and of course so you can't see it." "Fine," Paul said. "So it's just a lock. Is there a key?" "Sure," said Mr. Tanner's mum, with a grim laugh. "The problem's finding it. Obviously that bastard Humphrey's got it, and you can bet your knicker elastic he wouldn't have left it lying about. It can be in a very safe place, you can rely on that." They sat down on a bench under a tree. Mercifully, Mr. Tanner's mum had abandoned her goblin shape in favour of something a little less ostentatious, only marginally, as the whistles she prompted as they passed a building site amply testified. Paul assumed she was only doing it to annoy Sophie. Successfully. "Actually," Mr. Tanner's mum went on, "it's worse than that, because there's 2 keyholes on that stupid door thing, so there's got to be 2 keys, which means it'll be twice as hard tracking them down. And," she continued gloomily, "knowing Humphrey, it won't be nice straightforward knobbly bits of brass either. They'll be disguised as something, or there'll be some sort of stupid test you have to pass or something you've got to do before you can get at them or make them work. He's a terror for that sort of thing, is Humphrey. I remember when we first got the hot drinks machine, and he put a spell on it so only the pure in heart would get to do coffee, milk and 2 sugars. I told him, I said, pure in heart round here you must be." "Just a moment," Paul interrupted. "A test, you said?" "That's right. Or there was a time when he fixed the fax machine so only the 7th son of a 7th son could change the toner cartridge. Now it just so happens that Ricky Wormtater is a 7th son, but of course he's not always around. A lot of the time he's off on a job somewhere, and it's bloody inconvenient." "A test," Paul repeated. "Like in fairy tales and stuff?" "Yes, or folk tales. King Arthur and so forth." "Yes, he loves all that crap. Just a big kid, really. Nasty, spiteful bloody kid, but—"
"King Arthur!"
Sophie's eyes were as wide as saucers.
"The sword in the stone!"
Of course, Paul hadn't been to Sophie's house before. It was pretty much as he had imagined it. Double-glazed porch, tie-backs on the curtains, glass-topped coffee tables, stripped pine kitchen units. Sophie's parents weren't quite the hopelessly obsolete museum pieces she'd led them to expect. He rather liked them, in fact, especially the way that neither of them was particularly fazed when Sophie introduced her companions. "This is Rosie, her son's one of the partners. Oh, and this is Paul, wearing love," as she pushed past on her way back to the back door. There, on the grey paved patio, was the other sword in the stone, an exact duplicate of the one he'd grown used to sidestepping every time he crossed his bedsit floor to make a cup of tea. Neither rain, wind, nor blue tits had marred its glowing hilt or shining blade. Mrs. Pettingirl had tied one end of the washing line to it.
"We're still back where we started, though," Sophie pointed out. "I've tried, and so has Dad, and we can't shift the stupid thing out the stone."
Mr. Tanner's mum nodded. "Like I said," she replied, "it'll be a spell or an intelligence test. Humphrey's a right bastard, but he's good at what he does." Sophie thought for a while, and then suggested going round to B&Q and buying a jackhammer. Mr. Tanner's mum didn't think much of that idea, and while they were bickering about it in a fairly half-hearted fashion, Paul suddenly thought of something. Gilbert and Sullivan, he thought. Also, 2 hearts are better than 1. Just a moment, he said, putting his hand on the left branch of the cross-guard and beckoning Sophie over. Here, you catch hold of your side, and when I count to 3... It came out so smoothly that they nearly fell over, and sure enough, the very tip of the blade wasn't sharp and pointed. It was blunt and crinkly-edged, just like the wards of a key. "Well, I'm buggered," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "Looks like Humphrey's got a soppy streak or something." Paul wasn't so sure about that, but he kept his theory to himself. Having examined the end of the blade, he took a firm hold of the key portion and bent it sideways. The metal was brittle and snapped. He dropped the key into his pocket, put the sword back in the storn, and reattached the washing line. "1 now," he said. They still had enough left over from the expense money to run a taxi from Wimbledon to Kentish Town. Paul really wished he'd had a bit more notice, since the flat was in its usual state of scruffy disorder, whereby a bomb hitting it would count as a makeover. But Sophie appeared to be too wrapped up in the job in hand to notice, and he didn't really care what Mr. Tanner's mum thought. The second sword came out as easily as the first, and the key snapped off like the tip of an icicle. "Right," said Mr. Tanner's mum. "Here goes, then." So Paul pulled out the portable door from its cardboard tube 1 more time, and went through the preliminaries of smoothing it out and plastering it onto the wall. When it was ready, he took the first key and tried it in the top lock. It was a perfect fit, and so was its counterpart in the bottom. He straightened up and then hesitated. "In case anybody was wondering," he said, "I don't think it was Humphrey who put those keys there. I think it was somebody else." "So what?" said Mr. Tanner's mum impatiently. But Sophie shushed her. "Who?" she asked. Paul shrugged. I'm not sure," he said, "though my guess is the same person who arranged for each of us to get one. I think the keys were put there so Humphrey couldn't get at them, so that's why it took the 2 of us to get them out." Sophie frowned. "But that'd mean, well, whoever it was knew that you and me... And that's just stupid. I mean, we only realised earlier today, and we've had these sword things for ages." She turned on Mr. Tanner's mum and scowled. "What's so funny?" she demanded. "You are," Mr. Tanner's mum replied. "Bloody hell, it's been obvious for weeks the way you two've been going on." Paul shook his head. I think it goes back much further than that," he said. "This probably sounds pretty weird, but I think we were sort of like destined to find these keys. And each other," he added, going bright pink at the ears. "Not that it matters particularly," he added briskly. "Just thought I'd mention it." "Whatever," growled Mr. Tanner's mum. "But I'll tell you this, if you don't get a move on and open this door, you're destined to get my boot up your bum." Paul was no sceptic when it came to goblin prophecies. "Here goes nothing," he muttered under his breath, and gave the door a gentle shove. "Rosie! Arthur!" Paul looked away. It was enough to put you off true love for life. In passing, he wondered whether Arthur knew he had a son. Probably not, he reflected, and a mental image of Mr. Tanner floated into his mind. Well, he thought, he's got that to look forward to. Poor bastard. "Excuse me," said Pip mournfully, "but if you two could leave each other alone for just 1 moment." "You go ahead," replied Arthur, with his mouth full. "We'll catch up in just a second." Pip shrugged. "Don't mind if I do," he said. "I can't wait to get out of this awful place." He approached the threshold cautiously, as if expecting the door to bite him as he went through. "Odd," he said. "I've been dreaming of this moment for ever such a long time, and now it's actually here." "We don't know if it is yet," Sophie interrupted. "Only one way to find out, though." "True," Pip said. "Ah, well, regardless of what happens next, I'd just like to say thank you to both of you. And I'm most dreadfully sorry," he added to Paul, "about the dreams, I mean. Devil of a liberty and all that, intruding on another fellow's sleep, but—" Paul smiled. "That's all right," he said, "compared to what my dreams are usually like." "I know," Pip said. "Seen 'em, actually. But even so," he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and walked across the threshold. "Good Lord!" They could hear his voice on the other side. "That stain on the ceiling is still there. I remember writing to the landlord about that in 1874. "You next," snapped Mr. Tanner's mum, and she grabbed Arthur by his collar and frog-marched him through the door. "Well, I had to see if it was safe first, didn't I?" she explained. That was almost touching, in a way. She followed him, and then Sophie went through, and finally Paul. She closed the door gently, and then caught it as it rolled up and fell off the wall. "Well," he said, "that's it, I suppose." Pip and Arthur were standing in the middle of his floor, one on either side of the now swordless stone. "I hate to say this," Arthur said, "but I think I prefer the way we had it. Still, it's nice to be out." "Back," he amended. "Very nice," he added, and he smiled.
"Glad you're pleased," grunted Mr. Tanner's mum. "Now the next thing we've got to do is find Humphrey and shove him up himself with a long sharp—"
"No," Sophie said, surprising herself almost as much as she surprised everyone else.
"No, the first thing is to turn this other bloke loose. You know, what's his name? The senior partner, John Wellington. It's obvious, surely," she went on, as they all stared at her. "We can't take on Humphrey Wells on our own. He's like this really powerful wizard. He'd cast a spell on us or something, and we'll all end up in that horrible little room. But if we can rescue this John Wellington, presumably he's an even better wizard, and he can sort out Humphrey for us. I don't know why you're all gulping at me like that," she went on. "I'd have thought it was obvious myself."
Paul thought for a moment. "She's absolutely right," he said.
"Balls," snapped Mr. Tanner's mum. "Just wait till I get my claws on him. Won't be doing any magic for a very long time."
"Oh, well," Arthur started to say, but then he caught his girlfriend's eye and went very quiet. Pip, on the other hand, shook his head.
"I agree with the young lady," he said. "I think we'd best get the old devil, I mean John Wellington, before we go marching into Humphrey's office looking for a fight."
"I agree with him," said a voice from the corner of the room. "At least," it added, "that's what I'd have done in your shoes. Too late now, though."
They spun round, but before they'd stopped moving, the world started spinning in the opposite direction. Paul recognised the sensation. It was the same way he'd felt when Mr. Wormtoter's recovery charm had whisked them out of the doorless room a few hours earlier. When it stopped, he saw that they were all standing in the boardroom at the office, lined up alongside the mirror-polished table, as Humphrey Wells advanced towards them. He was wearing his conjurer's cloak and hat, and holding a saw.